Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Lucia Gomez, and I'm your host with Critica.NYC. In our last show, we had an opportunity to discuss the mental health of our athletes and the politics of winning gold in the Summer Olympics. We dived into what it really means to be excellent and how the greatest of all time, Simone Biles, right, my favorite sport in the whole wide world, gymnastics, really helped shape the new narrative around being safe, both physically and mentally. And in order to achieve true greatness, she needed to really take care of herself and put her ego and her pride aside, right? We heard that. She spoke about it. And I think we had a great opportunity in our last show to really dive into what it means to deal with mental health in a way that is part of your health and your well-being. And, you know, it is not shocking at all that athletes across the world are taking strong stances. And I was really impressed by this past Olympics to really see and understand the way in which women stood up for themselves, the way women actually had an opportunity to say, no, I don't want to wear the skinny weenie bikinis in a sport that, you know, doesn't require it. I really want to wear my long leggings for, you know, as leotards for gymnastics. And we saw some of the German gymnastics do that kind of thing. I really think it was a powerful say in the way in which a female athlete stood up and talked about the importance of being both true to themselves and true to the sport. And, you know, a lot of narratives around what it means for it to be achieving Olympic gold and what it means for all of us to see our athletes out there. But at the end of the day, they become role models. These last couple of weeks have been extremely interesting in the state of New York around the politics of being a woman, the realities of what happens when boundaries are crossed on a professional level. And, you know, we saw the census numbers go down and, you know, we saw the census numbers be released and the power of numbers in being able to achieve some power and some presence for the state of New York and for the city of New York specifically, who saw an increase in their numbers in the past decade, both visibility for certain populations as well as invisibility for others, because the reality is that, you know, we always say strength in numbers, and there's something to be said about, you know, numbers bringing power, and yet more and more we see the fact that that's not necessarily reflected in that way. Today, we're going to have a conversation about both those things, both about, you know, the way in which race and gender is viewed in the sports arena and how these athletes use their powerful voices in the public to really bring us fascinating conversations in the general public and across the world, and how that changes and shifts narratives. And then we'll talk a little bit more about what it means to shift narratives when census data comes out. And we saw all the interesting press around the census data. And essentially, what are all the power moves that are happening throughout the state of New York now, when we just saw Governor Cuomo resign about a week ago, and he has a couple more days left, and we're going to see the lieutenant governor. Once again in our history, at least in my history that I've seen, a lieutenant governor become governor. And then what that means when first female, you know, will become the governor of the state of New York, Lieutenant Governor Kathy Hochul, and essentially her selection of a lieutenant governor to fill that role as she finishes up the term, and then essentially, who knows, maybe even continue on to her own full term. And so I think we're going to have a lot of great conversations. I want to invite anyone who's on who wants to ask questions to please use our live Facebook feed, our chat section, to add your questions so that we're hopefully able to answer some of them, or just, you know, plant the seed and trigger some great conversation. So for starters, I actually want to invite Gemma Alexander Mozique, who is the women's and men's head tennis coach over at CUNY's own York College. So welcome, Gemma. How are you?
Hi there. I'm well. Nice to be here. Thank you.
Oh, this is awesome. So, Gemma, we were going to have you on the last show, and I think, you definitely, I'm so happy we're able to connect with you today and really have a conversation. You and I had an offline conversation that kind of had me a little jazzed up, around, people say politics only exists like in the electoral arena, or we have politics in the workplace. We have politics, in the athletic fields. And some people want to say, don't bring that to like, this is just a game. You win, you lose. And I'm like, no, this is amazing. It's historical, right? That it's always been used as a platform for folks to really dig into some strong social issues in some essence. This time we saw a lot of personal choices take play. And, even in your realm of tennis, right, we had Naomi Osaka make some bold moves and decisions. Why don't you tell us a little bit about whether, how that helped shape or not shape, right, and what the discussion was, in that different field of tennis?
Well, from the US Open last year and her decision to use her platform to join in the conversations and start conversations about civil rights, voting, police brutality, and from a young lady who actually, prior to her using that platform in that way, had been really pretty quiet and shy almost. But made bold statements without even uttering a sound. I mean, she put on face masks with the names of, Philando Castilla and Breonna Taylor and Tamir Rice. So, I mean, the woman didn't utter a word and yet spoke many, many words and loudly globally. The US Open is an international tournament. She's number one in the world. And each day she went out, she played. She's doing it right now. I believe she's in a tournament this week. And she had already announced that any money she made from the tournament was going to go to Haiti in the wake of the earthquake and so on. So, and we have a history of it in our sport, right? We think of tennis as a sport where folks of color really haven't shown through, except for Venus and Serena. But we know that's not true. We know that Arthur Ashe in his time, same thing, very much in Naomi Osaka. He didn't say a word. He stood at the net during Wimbledon after winning and being the first Black male to do so, and held up his fist and join the conversation, or going over to South Africa with Harry Belafonte and others, Sidney Poitier and so on, and helping to lead their efforts to do away with apartheid. So we've had this activism streak in our sport with very few people of color. It's been kind of an amazing thing. And Naomi Osaka and of course Venus and Serena have been at the forefront, particularly Serena, in using their platform to engage public comment for their entire careers, really. So, we're just continuing the tradition, even though we're coming from this sport where we're not supposedly involved.
So that's kind of like a great pivot a little bit, right? Because, we've seen it in football, right? With the kneeling and the national anthem and the uproars and folks, kind of even some athletes not being able to reintegrate, even though it's taken off and their voices have escalated outside, have been elevated outside of the sport. But, football, which traditionally has been many more African-American players, basketball, same deal, platforms, opportunity to speak up, we talked about this in the Latin gymnastics, right? Not a traditional sport, but the greatest of all time is an African American woman who is 24 years old now. And she comes from a family where she was, she talks about, being a foster child to, her grandfather and her grandfather's, spouse. And essentially, telling a different story of what, the opportunities unfold for many athletes, and some of these extremely expensive,
Mm-hmm.
elite, and really like sports that aren't traditional in our neighborhood, right? You can pick up a stick and a ball, you can pick up a basketball, but hockey equipment is expensive. A pool doesn't come by everyone's, right? A
Yeah.
tennis field. Tell us a little bit about, the dynamics in your, when it comes down to, race and ethnicity and opportunities in some of these sports and how that plays out, right? Because, them speaking up is very different than another athlete in some cases speaking up in their sport.
It's such an interesting thing. I mean, I'm a tennis player, right? I didn't just pop up and become a college coach. And I've been in my sport for decades. We're not going to go into my age right now, but it's been decades. And, often, it's certainly in the early days, I was the only woman of color in the room. Sometimes the only woman in the room, right? I mean, I'm going out to the park to play, and more guys out there than girls, and so in many ways we keep breaking barriers. So when it's gender related, who has done more in sport, male or female, than Billie Jean King? Absolutely no one, right? And yet, and yes, she's a white woman, but she came from middle class, maybe even lower middle class means. Chris Everett, who we think of, as the epitome of the tennis, the tennis goddess, who is supposedly, I guess, rich and so on. Her dad was a tennis pro out at like her public park courts. So I mean, in terms of class, you have these folks who have risen to the top of our sport, but they came from modest means. And then you see these people of color who, for some reason in this country, if you break through and you're Black in particular, you've come from the inner city and so on. We saw Venus and Serena and Richard and Orsine, and that was an intact Black family for certainly the beginnings of their career. We saw mommy and daddy. Now we see Coco Gauff, the young, phenom from Wimbledon a few years ago, and who's still doing great things on the tour. She's young. And we look in the stands and we see mom and dad. And we're constantly told this story of somehow, oh, the Black athletes, they're poor, they're all coming from these urban centers and from the inner city, and and some kid who just kind of made it through. When you and I both know in our sports, you can't just make it through. It's too expensive to just make it through. So, in large measure, if it's not mom and dad both in the house, they certainly work together to raise the child and to pay all the expenses. And then there's grandma and grandpa, or, foster grandma and aunt and uncle, and all of these community supports and familial supports. And so we keep busting through all these images of who supposedly we are in the community. When we see a Richard Williams, when we see dad in the stands, it's a wonderful thing. And you'll see a Maria Sharapova and you only see dad. Where's mom?
Yeah.
But in our sport, you see all these women break through and you see mom and dad. So there are these class things that keep getting broken, as well as obviously the race things that keep getting broken.
And the stereotypes, right? Like the parental stereotypes.
That's exactly right. Or the gender stuff. Billie Jean King got on that court and she beat Bobby Riggs, and she, changed this whole thing. And what people don't realize is what she did for us in sports in terms of equal pay. That had ramifications for every single part of our society. I could not coach a men's team if Billie Jean King had lost that match, maybe, I mean, she said, hey, we're ready. We can compete. We should be paid equally. And the ramifications throughout society, we're still not fully there. But, she helped make huge strides just in what she did in the early days. And we know, Billie Jean's still out there. I think she was on air this morning. Still out there pushing along and helping us to get to that last, glass ceiling, whether it's in a corporate arena or, whatever, a governmental political arena. And we come from these places that supposedly folks in our sports don't come from. And time and time and time again, we keep popping up. So the stereotypes are just that. They're just stereotypes. They don't seem to ever be true. They just don't.
And yet the pressure, right? Like, I kind of feel like the pressure, I mean, listen, I'm not going to, front on the fact that I have a 14-year-old who says, I've been in the sport, I think, because I feel that pressure of representing for all the other little girls who are not here, who perhaps haven't been given the same opportunities as I. And she's like, maybe I don't even want to be in the sport anymore, right? Like, I'm done. It's not easy environmentally for young people to thrive in an environment where perhaps they don't see themselves in it. Perhaps they don't make the same, emotional connections to elite sport, or even just because of the climate, right, and the environment and the things that they believe in, when society still continues to turn outside that court.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, things happen, and overwhelmingly, both Naomi, right, and Simone, right, they could not, they're not living out, they're not in a bubble, right? They are who they are, and they're unfortunately or fortunately, right, they're treated, and they're, we see amazing athletes, but the moment they step out of that realm, right, the moment they creep into, like, using their power for other things than hitting the ball or, vaulting, amazing scores, we somehow feel uncomfortable.
It's incredible, as if these people are not full round human beings, right? So, why are they speaking about politics? Why not? They're citizens, right? They're citizens. Don't we expect them to vote? Don't we expect them to know what's going on? Just because they're athletes, they don't know this stuff? When did this happen? And look, there's certainly with women, right? There's this tradition of trying to tell people how difficult some of these public facing things are, whether it was Princess Di, right? Or Meghan Markle. Those of us on the outside looking at them in their fishbowl have no idea the kinds of pressures they're under globally, right? Not just to perform, but to be at their best all the time. Don't let a hair be out of place. When you're on the vault, that's ridiculous.
Yeah, we saw that criticism with Gabby Douglas.
Early on,
and her hair, years ago. Yeah.
What the heck? I mean, you get it. Sure, you'd like to be at your best, and maybe then you'll capture that extra endorsement. But you're at work. What mechanic would we say, look, he's got an oil stain on his shirt? Oh, what? Of course. You're at work. You're going to sweat.
That's fascinating. Because you said my word, right? Work. Like,
that's right.
You're at work. This is
you're at work. And I don't think, when we talk about this the mental illness, or not mental illness, but the mental struggles, right, that they're going through. And a lot of it is just that they are, when they're at work, being asked to be perfect, not just in their sport, but in these other realms, right? So we've decided that they're spokespeople. We've decided that, they have to be role models for our children. And as such, hair can't be out of place. The clothes have to be just right. They have to be exactly poised. You just finished a 4-hour tennis match in the heat, in August heat. And if your wording isn't just right, or, some other such thing, because you're not then the perfect role model to promote, some sort of chip or cookie.
And I believe Naomi Osaka decided not to speak to press, right? And
that's exactly right. And the backlash, I've had conversations about that just this week, where folks were where folks were like, look, she's a role model and she's in this sport, and it is her responsibility after a match. And she said, look, it might be my responsibility, but I'm a human being. And at this moment, I can't do it. Imagine what would have happened if she had done it and said the wrong thing, right? Or stumbled in some sort of way. Then we would have had a whole nother backlash. I mean, folks, all she had to do was go in and say, hey, I lost, I didn't play so well, and that's that. And I don't really want to talk anymore. No, the reporters doing their jobs would have kept asking more questions. And so the chances of her stumbling in some other way and not being that perfect role model for us to show our children or whatever, I don't know.
I mean, do you think it would have been, you think it's different though, the fact that, I mean, listen, I was listening to this comedian, I was dying. I was like, it makes people uncomfortable. And he was clear. He made a joke about it. And I thought it was, I found it hilarious. He's like, why don't we get it straight? Like you are, white folks are uncomfortable that it is he was like a little black girl. I'm like, no, she's a woman, right? Little black girl making decisions for herself about what is good for her, and yet everybody whips out the flags, how she's betraying her country and somehow not kind of like being a brat and being too privileged, that all of a sudden she's got mental health. Had she broken a foot and been that girl who got on that foot and went the runway, these are what we elevate as role models. I'm not sure
broken a foot. Can you imagine? I mean, she's, on a 4-inch beam, broken her neck. Yes, she said, I can't do it. And who are we to tell her that she can?
Yeah.
Because she's an Olympian. Well, I'm an Olympian, but today I can't do it. And what strikes me as interesting is women actually who, and I've had this conversation about Simone and her choices with women who are moms, who have had to balance work, right, outside of the home, motherhood, school, carpool, this, that, and the other. And we talk about how hard it is, right? So yesterday I could do it, but today I can't. I need some rest. And she said, normally I can do it, but today I can't. And I'm not willing to risk my life by falling to do something that I know I can't do. And again, I say this in the wake of Princess Di. Didn't we learn this? She said, this fishbowl thing is too hard. We're just human beings. We can't be your perfection. And all of you collectively, not just some one of you, we can't be your perfection. You have to find this somewhere else or, through multiple people. I mean, I've literally heard that, in Naomi's case, well, Billie Jean always did it, but that was another time. She wasn't in the limelight every single moment in the way that Naomi is, and I do understand. Don't get me wrong. If Naomi or Simone, if they can't play, there are jobs at stake, right? You have ushers and officials, certainly TV broadcasts and so on that are affected. And so it's not just about the dollars, although, there can be tens of millions of dollars at stake, but also people's jobs, right? And so when that one person doesn't show up and you can't film that day, now it's affecting you too. And I absolutely get that. But at the end of the day, do we want another Anthony Bourdain on our hands?
Right.
Right. They're human beings. They can't do it. Give them a break. And in our sport, so as a coach, I know that in those male team sports, basketball, football, right? You take a big loss, who goes in front of the cameras? The coaches do, not the players. They'll catch you real quick as you're exiting the field, right? Catch you real quick, right, as you're going into the locker room. You'll say a word or two and you'll keep going. You don't have to sit there for an hour and answer by yourself every question.
It's so funny that you're saying that because it's kind of true.
Right. They have coaches and then whole teams of players. They can pick one if they need to actually put a player in front of the media. But in our sports, you have this one human being who has to finish competing, towel off, get their hair right and their makeup right, and then in some cases sit for hours and answer every kind of question. And again, the reporters are just doing their jobs, but the entire situation is just too much. They're just human beings. And then you layer on, what they thought politically. And yes, they use the platform and by all means, ask them these questions. But there's a time and a place for everything. And I just think we've had situation after situation with famous people, right? Whether athletes or not. And I'll go back to Princess Di, Anthony Bourdain. Yeah. Their stories tell us, don't push so hard. Give them a moment. They'll come back. Push too hard. Now you have nothing, right?
Yeah. And essentially, it's interesting that you talked about work. You talked about, the investments, the sponsorships,
Yeah.
right? The corporate engagement around the price of success for some of these folks,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Then you add the element of all the investment that is placed into, and listen, let's not get it wrong. Like, it happens to all of us. Like, I say, my investment in gymnastics and my daughter was because I'm like, as a single mom, that I was going to invest in her and her gym, her athletic success because she was good at it, and
Right.
therefore would help her for her future if she decided to take that to another level. So I can not only imagine how many parents out there and how many, young people want to be in a sport. Now we see the NCAA allowing some of these athletes. Do you think any of that is going to change? And in particular, are young people of color that definitely come from different class backgrounds? Definitely we see more so diverse class backgrounds where the investment has been in their children's success. How does that play into now with the NCAA rules changing and all
Yeah.
that?
Well, look, it's a strange thing. You become really good at hitting a ball. You become really good at, dismounting from something. That's what you practice. That's what you're good at. And because of it, and it's a wonderful thing, don't get me wrong, you get these endorsement things, right? Sort of this extra added bonus in terms of ways that you can make a living. Yeah, that's terrific. But did you practice for that? Right? Were you prepped for that? I think you said your daughter is a
Yeah.
gymnast and has been for years, right? So what, maybe 10, 12, 14 years she's been in her sport?
12.
All of that time, she was practicing her flips and her dismounts.
Yeah.
She wasn't busy practicing, her speech patterns and
Yes.
right. And she certainly wasn't spending time in front of the mirror and getting her makeup right and all of that. Those are other careers. But when you're good in sports, you're now thrust into those other careers too. And I'm not going to say you don't want it. Sure, those are revenue streams, but it isn't what you were primarily. Well, it's not what you primarily set out to do. It wasn't your primary goal. And then you're asked to, in terms of product endorsement and so on, you're asked to be professionals in those careers like a model would, right? Whose job it is just to do that. That model doesn't have to turn around and dismount anything, do a backflip, hit a tennis ball, run a mile. They just model. You now, as an athlete, are expected to be in your sport and do the modeling, and do the speechifying. Oh, but nothing that you find important to say.
That's right.
It really all is all kind of crazy, and it's unfortunate because it is going to start to make it harder. And then you layer on what's happening with the NCAA because it's trickling down now, right? From I remember when I was a kid, the professional athletes I would see in my sport. Some of the guys, I'm going to throw in a bunch of names, Vitas Gerulaitis, Ilya Nastasi. These guys had a good time, right? And the women as well, right? Virginia Wade, they played their sport, but if they were here in New York for the US Open, you'd see them out at the restaurants after and stuff. They actually had a life outside of the sport. Nowadays, you don't see these folks, and it's not because they want to be sheltered necessarily. They don't have a choice. Because they're expected, right? They're expected to do all of these other things as well. And it just starts to become too much. And so now, because there's so much money in it, because there's so many opportunities to go around, all of this sort of professional behavior is trickling down into the college levels. And in some ways, I mean, it should. Look at how good these college athletes are, right? They are working a job. And they're not.
And our colleges are making a lot of money.
And they're not getting paid. Where else could that be legal in the country we live in? It's not. And so, sports are going to lead the way into a whole bunch of conversations now, right? Whether it's pay, equity, or pay at all. and then of course these mental health issues and what it means to be a professional athlete, and whether it is your responsibility because you worked for 15 years at hitting something, that now it's your responsibility to get your outfit right all the time and be ready to speak at a moment's notice.
I mean, Gemma, honestly, like, for me, because perhaps I wear multiple hats and I have to, be in the hot pink tights with my daughter at the,
Yes.
at the meet, and do those multiple, and then still, wear my professional hat at work, and, do the parts of the politics. I realize that you can use sports in so many ways to, engage in good conversation about daily life and about the politics and the policies that are created, the environments that we see, and human behavior, and the trends that are set by society to accept or not accept certain norms. It's become the place where folks who say, oh, I don't like politics, right? But they put on they're always watching the World Series and
Yeah.
all the playoffs, and they're watching. And unfortunately, if we don't capture them there,
Yep.
in their passion for, sports, then, and we're definitely not going to catch them watching, CNN or MSN or even Fox, right? Like, we're not going to catch it there. We need to find and meet people where they are to have honest conversation about mental health.
That's exactly
about
right.
Pay equity.
That's
right?
exactly right.
About social justice and Black Lives Matter.
Yeah.
So I welcome, the fact that we have these athletes that for decades and historically we've seen athletes use their pulpit to kind of stand up for things that they believe in. And it is amazing that we have women kind of elevating real things that are about them and their health and their decision and their voice and their power.
Absolutely. Right? In my sport, in tennis, through my entire career in it, there's Billie Jean King, there's Martina Navratilova. The number of Eastern European kids in this sport that have just, taken over the sport in the last 30, 40 years, it is phenomenal. And it's the legacy really of that one woman. Martina Navratilova started winning things, and all of a sudden you saw overs everywhere. Right. We are powerful. We send powerful messages. Her early message, without saying a word, was about commitment and dedication and how far you could go. Because in her early career, she had talent, but not so much discipline, right? In her early professional career. Yeah. And then a basketball player said, "What are you doing?" Nancy Lieberman from New York said, "What are you doing? You're a professional. Get your act together." And she hit the gym. And when she hit the gym, women all over the world hit the gym.
We're hitting the gym.
Right? Yeah. Tremendous. And little girls from countries that, we couldn't place on a map were all of a sudden, tops globally in this global sport. That's an amazing thing. But to act as if they are just that for public's consumption and not human beings with things to say sometimes, and sometimes not a thing to say, right? And bad hair days, I don't think I'm having one right now, but it is what it is. Bad hair days, and but they're doing their best. Meet them where they are. Because if we don't, we run the risk of losing all of these folks to the sport, because the work, like mommy's work, becomes too much. It's too varied, and they're not prepared for all of it. Right? They're prepared for the sport piece of it, and maybe prepared for one other piece of it. I don't know which, but one other. But we've got these people trying to juggle what is essentially 4 and 5 different careers. It's ridiculous.
Gemma, I really want to thank you for joining me today. I'm really happy that we finally got a chance to kind of really dive into this conversation because, in our next segment we're going to invite Eli Valentina, and I want to thank you, Gemma, for kind of your expertise on the matter, right? You've been in the sport, and we're talking about role models a little bit, whether you accept that role or not, right? Representation matters. And once we see it, folks gravitate to it. It's a way to lift, our young women that are, want to be engaged. And at the same time, Eli, I want to invite Eli Valentine, who's our, thank you very much, Gemma, for being
so
with
happy
us.
to be here.
Thank you. I want to invite Eli Valentine, who is a political analyst, and most recently, wrote a piece, an opinion piece in the Gotham Gazette, and it caught my attention for a lot of reasons. But welcome, Eli. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Lucia. Pleasure.
I'm sure you got an earful, and I welcome your take on our previous discussion. But I want to kick us off a little bit on this representation piece, right? Because I think Gemma really, again, I love using alternative means to get at certain subject matters, because if not, people won't pay attention to the things that may be really changing and impacting their lives. And in this case, it's the state of politics and the state of affairs in their backyards in the state of New York. And we recently saw Governor Cuomo say he will resign in the next couple of days, right? Giving himself the 2 weeks to do what he has to do. And we will see Kathy Hochul be Lieutenant Governor Hochul be our next governor, be the first woman governor in the state of New York. Not the first time, and I got to experience firsthand, a shift in 2008 with then Spitzer, gave the reins over to Governor Patterson. Definitely did not give Governor Patterson 2 weeks, nor the excitement of, that we're hearing now about who is going to be the lieutenant governor. But tell us a little bit about your take on it, and what you wrote in your opinion piece that I found interesting to call you on today.
Yeah, thank you for again inviting me. So part of it, just so I guess our audience knows, the incoming governor will appoint the lieutenant governor, so it doesn't go through the state senate or the state assembly. So her pick will be her pick automatically. So the state constitution gives the lieutenant or the governor, in this case, the leeway to appoint who she wants, Kathy Hochul. So my article just makes a case for Hochul to select a Latino, not simply for the sake of a Latino, but as you said in your previous segment, because representation matters. The fact is that Latinos, in terms of the ethnic groups in New York State, we're the largest, right? And we have surpassed African Americans by over 200,000 voters, which is double the size of the city of Albany, to put it in perspective. So representation matters. Latinas, we have never had a Latino governor. We have never had a Latino mayor in New York City. We have never had a Latino lieutenant governor. And it's time. I mean, we are here, and even beyond the fact that we have the numbers, the fact is that we have people that can fulfill that role, the task, and do it well. We have plenty of candidates that will serve the people of New York very well.
Eli, I give it to many decades of watching Angelo Falcone, break down the numbers for us immediately following Election Day. I missed that like there's no tomorrow. So, reading your article was great, just to give me a little bit of a kind of reflection on what he did, right? He will break down why the power representation matters, how many elected officials we currently have that are Latino, what ethnicity, how many staff, in terms of high-level policymakers, because at the end of the day, there is a table, whether or not people want to, see no table exists and have all the people you can, kind of be a part of a transparent process in our democracy. The reality is that a table does exist, and who sits in it makes a difference, because names will not pop up unless you know who those people are. You've worked in some of those neighborhoods, and I know folks from the Bronx that don't know folks from Brooklyn, in the Brooklyn scene, right? Or Queens not really engaging with the Bronx or the Upper Manhattan scene. So there, we live in a certain way, and our politics is always, right, all politics are local. But to have a conversation that the future governor of the state of New York can have an opportunity to give an opportunity to the first Latino to be in a statewide post, and an elected and perhaps an appointed, right? Because we do have Secretary of State Rossano Rosado, we had Cesar Perales, we had Lorraine Cortez Vasquez, right, in those roles, and yet not even engaged, because a lot of the conversations aren't around a Latino name that I'm hearing in terms of being up for the task, or being an option, although she's doing her rounds and meeting everyone. What do you say about the fact that we have not been able to, through the electorate, elect someone citywide, someone essentially statewide? I mean, to win statewide office is a very different feat than to win, in the city of New York, where the Latino community saw in the most recent release of the census, as you kind of alluded to in terms of the electorate, but we saw a natural increase of Latinos while other populations decreased. First time that the state saw the white population decrease, and that made all the headlines, right? But the Latino community has been consistent in growth, in particular in Queens and in the Bronx. We recently won a borough-wide race in Brooklyn. We lost the borough-wide race in the Boogie Down Bronx, which has always, or at least since I could remember, I guess since Fernando Ferrer and such, been represented by a Latino. But what do you say, why haven't we been able to achieve those, those steps into citywide or statewide elected office?
I think there are various reasons. One is that you mentioned the table, right? I think that's a good analogy. The fact is, and maybe it's an old cliche, right? But, the fact is Latinos have not been invited to the table. And those that have gotten there, they have to force their way to the table. And that's one reality, right? We have county chair persons that, they've discounted Latinos, have not counted on them for leadership positions within the respective political parties. I think that's one aspect of it, right? Then there's a second part, and you mentioned the great Angelo Falcón, who in many ways I model my own work after him, and may he rest in peace. But Angelo told me once, I'm not as optimistic as you are, folks. I always remember that. But I think what he was referring to, now what I think I know, is that the fact is that Latinos need to learn that in order to gain power, we need to go to the polls. And when we look at voting participation, right, this is not just a New York thing. This is a national thing. I always refer people to this work by Bernard Fraga. It's called the Turnout Gap. And in that book, he looks at the fact that Latinos and Asians, Asian Americans are historically at the lower tiers in terms of voting participation. That is the case for Latinos in New York. We fail to vote. And when we do that, we just disempower ourselves. And the fact is that we have the numbers, right? So, I mean, statewide, there are 1.7 million Latinos that are registered to vote. 1.7. I mean, it's incredible. It's the highest that it's ever been. But when you look at voting participation numbers, it's like, we're just down there. So I think part of it is external. It's what's been done to us, but also part of internal, what we're doing to ourselves.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, partly, right? there is that responsibility, obviously, of being in, of turning out to vote and launching good campaigns. It's the technicality of like being able to win at the end of the day and not being told no. And, but then there's also the element, and especially in this case, where, what triggered you is an opportunity by a senior elected, in this case, going to be the governor of the state of New York, to seize an opportunity to balance things out, right? And it comes, to mind this whole, sharing is caring, folks. Like, we have an opportunity, give us a chance. And then part of me, I guess that element of the political animal in me says, well, why do we got to share anything? All of a sudden, there's this Anglo governor, potentially another one, that all of a sudden has to be the equalizer of all things just, and in this case it would be. And at the same time, I'm like, for a very long time we've had a one-sided dynamic of leadership that has been mostly Anglo for years, because I grew up in the process where I had a Shelley Silver, right? Where we had a Bruno, leader Bruno, and they were all white. Pataki was white. Cuomo was white. Cuomo is white. Like, the other one. So like, why do we need to see why does anybody need to give us a diverse space, right? And in all of hearts, I want to say, yes, give us the opportunity. But why can't an African-American, whether it's Jamal Bailey, whether it is, Senator, Benjamin, represent the interests of a community, represent them right, regardless if they're Black or Latino, or Anglo or, Asian. And why do they feel, especially the African-American community, everyone's saying, like, well, we have too many African-Americans. They're speaker and the leader of the Senate and the mayor now. And it's like, they outright earned that. They busted their butt for that, right? Like, and if the, incoming governor of the state of New York wants to appoint another African-American to a post, what's wrong with that?
Yeah. Oh, that's a great point. That's a fair point.
I mean, that's just me like thinking, well, I know if I had it, why wouldn't I want it? I mean, representation matters, right? Absolutely. Elevating our folks for decades, for historically, African Americans have been carrying the Democratic Party as their own electorate, even statewide, dwindles, and many more turn to the Republican Party, right? So absolutely. Like, there's something to be said about that, no?
Yeah, absolutely. And I say it in my column, African Americans have historically always fought to get their fair share, right? I mean, this is a historically disadvantaged group, and kudos to them, right? You mentioned the Speaker of the Assembly, the Senate Majority Leader, the incoming potentially, right, mayor, we know Rick is gonna win. I mean, come on. But the public advocate, right? 5 Democratic county leaders in the city of New York are African American. So et cetera, et cetera. Yeah. So the thing is, I've always believed that I think representation, at least political representation, should reflect the reality of the. And so then that's why I say, as a Latino, and we have been here, but again, for numerous reasons, we have not been thought of, and part of it is self-inflicted wounds, as I mentioned before. But I really believe that elected representation should be reflective of the people, and that means also the appointments that these leaders in executive positions, they should also be conscious of that. Our government should look like the people that they represent.
I think that's fascinating. I mean, it's no shock that there's numerous conversations happening around, who the incoming mayor has as transition team, resumes that are going to begin to be sent to that transition team. And, who would they have, who he has as deputy mayor, who sits on one side versus another, right? Like all those pieces where we did towards the end see in Adams, Eric Adams, Borough President Eric Adams camp, folks like Ruben Diaz Jr., Bronx Borough President. We saw Congressman Adriano Espaillat, and then early on we saw Councilmember Idani Rodriguez and Councilmember Francisco Moya, right, on the Latino side, get on early on with the candidate Eric Adams, and yet we had a Latina. We had Diane Morales, right, who, we saw her numbers did not do well, but it was also at a financial, wasn't part of the mainstream, had, some errors towards the end of her campaign, that really, really kind of shot her chances. We did see Catherine Garcia almost take it from Eric Adams, and yet, as we enter census and redistricting process, we know that racially polarized voting exists. And racially polarized voting is, if given that chance for a Latino to, select a Latino. And I would love to see the breakdown of those numbers, right, by election districts that have high Latino populations, on whether or not they chose Adams versus Garcia. As an example, somewhat, I feel like Catherine Garcia was, one of those that could have been a real Catherine Garcia. Let's just put in quotation marks, and that means a Latina Garcia. But I feel like, do you think that made an impact, her last name and racially polarized voting, and how Latinos selected their number one and then number two candidates? Did that play anything? Can we speculate anything on that front?
Yeah, identity politics, as much as people, don't like it, it plays a role. That's a reality. And we see it in this election as well. It's interesting, when I analyze the numbers, I think I wrote a piece for Gotham Gazette looking at how Eric Adams, how the whole mayoral thing worked out. In the Bronx, which is the only Latino majority borough in the city of New York, he got almost 50% of the Latino vote. When I looked at the high Latino election districts, almost half. Now, when we look at other boroughs with high Latino concentrations, like portions of Manhattan and really Queens, that number is reduced, but he still earns well over a third of the Latino vote. So he did earn more than Garcia, a lot more than Diane Morales, but we did see a propensity for Latinos to go with Eric Adams more than the candidates with Latino surnames, which is to see why, but that's how the Latino vote trended in this past election.
That's great to see. I mean, I know I'm waiting to see the overlay of these numbers. I mean, I think CUNY's mapping project has an overlay of how folks voted, and in general, how the electorate voted in the Jumani Williams versus Kathy Hochul race for lieutenant governor. And I thought fascinating to see pockets where I know geographically Latinos are, particularly in the Bronx and Queens, and our numbers definitely are always less in the voter side. Forget about just voter turnout, right? I mean, simply on the eligibility factor, younger population, many more coming of age, especially those that have come from Mexican American backgrounds, that have been born and raised in New York City. I feel like we've been waiting for that since 2000, when we saw the big boom of the Mexican population in East Harlem and in Sunset Park and in parts of Queens and even in Upper Manhattan, aside from East Harlem. What do you tell us? I mean, look, we just heard Gemma talk about representation matters, and we started this conversation. But we have an election. We just won 14 Latinos in the city council. I want to say that's almost like more than ever. And I totally include, Sandy Nurse being half Panamanian. I'm absolutely claiming Sandy as a Latina. We have a Colombiana in Jen Gutierrez. We have Amanda Farias, who's Puerto Rican and Dominican. We have, 5 Dominicans, 5 Puerto Ricans. Like, I feel like I did the math. And then like 1 Ecuadorian, we have a lot of Latinos.
Yes.
In the upcoming city council, a lot of energy and potential, future opportunities there. What would you think, step one, as a community, just thinking about why it's so important that our issues are at the forefront of an agenda, especially when our numbers continue to grow and we embrace New York City as a home. What is our step one as a community? What would you encourage folks to do first?
I think the first thing is to see that we're in this boat together, right? You mentioned the diversity that exists within the Latino community, and I think that's one of the beauties of our Latinidad. But it's also been one of our biggest challenges, right? Where we have seen rifts between Puerto Ricans, Dominicans, Puerto Ricans, and you know, so I think the first thing is that we need to see ourselves as members of the same boat. So I think unification is so important, right? I think that holding our leaders accountable is important because Latinos are always at the bottom tiers of the economic ladder, right? Look at our rates. The highest are in East Harlem, which is, still among Latinos is a predominantly Puerto Rican community, much more diverse than what it was 20 years ago. And I'm from East Harlem, raised there. So, so I think we have, so which requires the unity, but it also requires accountability on those that we have elected. Again, and by consequence, it's about engagement, right? We need to teach civic engagement so that people take control of flight.
Yeah, I think, we have a couple of opportunities as we go forward. One, I want to definitely invite you back, Eli. I think we can have, and we'll definitely prepare some slides for folks so that we can see the numbers. I didn't want to dive in right away because I feel like, census is going to be up in topic of conversation in the next couple of weeks as we take a look at the demographics and the numbers. Reality is that the census plays into the economic, opportunities that go into neighborhoods and building and creating schools and bringing transportation resources. I want to make sure that we continue this conversation around census, right? And the numbers and what they tell us and what they don't. And while at the same time, Eli, the fact is that the incoming class of city council members, I just talked about 14 Latinos, but there's diversity all throughout because there's some firsts in other communities as well, are going to select their next speaker of the city council, which Latinos have had an opportunity to have someone elected by their peers. In that case, it was Melissa Mark Riverito, elected in 2013 to be the speaker of the city council, by her peers, and she represented us. And I sometimes had un orgullo to listen to her on Univision and know that she was speaking the language and telling the general public about our issues. Pero, in 10 seconds or less, any predictions on speaker of the city council?
Wow, that's a tough one. Hopefully a Latina, but I don't know. I think Justin Brennan has a good shot as well. He's from Brooklyn, and Brooklyn is the biggest borough. If they unite, they can have their own speaker.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Eli, for joining us today. And again, I look forward to having other conversations around, this very same topic. So thank you so much.
Thank you for having me, Lucy.
And thank you, Manhattan Neighborhood Network, for another amazing Critica.NYC program. I definitely look forward to seeing the numbers. So have a good one.